2015 in Lusaka, Zambia, I had the distinct honor of receiving the unanimous vote of shareholders to become the bank's third president. In my acceptance speech, which I made emotionally because I knew the shareholders took a risk on me, given that I just recovered from a very serious illness. I made a solemn promise to shareholders, and I quote, to deliver a solid bank that will be a leader among its peers in all measures of financial performance, to quickly grow the capital of the bank in absolute terms, improve capitalization through innovative capital management initiatives, ensure first-class risk management, and achieve adequate returns to shareholders. I said then that we will build risk buffers that will adequately protect the bank as it intervenes in difficult markets. In terms of development focus, I said that, I quote, that we will give priority to interventions that will have the broadest development impact. Promotion of intra-African trade will therefore be a priority as it will improve Africa's dynamic comparative advantage in the export of light manufactures. I emphasize that we will give priority to the financing and promotion of high-value exports that have the capability of stabilizing export revenues and creating jobs. That we will aim to support the creation of commercially viable medical centers of excellence so that never again will hundreds of thousands of Africans die simply because they are not able to obtain visas to travel abroad for healthcare. As to my personal commitment, I stressed on that occasion that there will be no sacrifice too great for me to make for a bank that saved my life. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I stand before you most pleased and fulfilled that I kept my promises. I gave the job the best of my energy, intellect, courage, and determination. As a result, between 2020, the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, and May 2025, and with the strong support of our shareholders, Afreximbank invested approximately $120 billion in Africa and the Caribbean, and $150 billion in the 10 years I was president. These must rank among the highest by any standards. And the fact that we invested $150 billion and have a capital of $43 billion tells you that Africans pay their debt.
On this CNBC Africa special, we turn our focus to the 32nd Annual Meetings of Afreximbank, a landmark gathering that celebrates a decade of transformative leadership under President Benedict Oramah and ushers in a new chapter with the appointment of his successor. I'm Benedict Oramah, and I'll be guiding you through the key moments, the milestones, and messages that shaped this pivotal event. The Transcorp Hilton in Abuja played host to the 32nd Annual Meetings of Afreximbank, a high-level gathering of heads of state, industry captains, and global investors, all converging to assess the bank's transformational impact on African trade. This year's theme, Building the Future on Decades of Resilience, could not be more timely, unfolding amid global economic headwinds and rising geopolitical uncertainty.
Indeed, it is our honor to host you as part of the bank's 2025 annual meetings and associated capacity and knowledge sharing events. These annual meetings have become pivotal in generating ideas, shaping policy design, and changing the narrative, while at the same time creating a platform for forging constructive partnerships and strategic alliances. Accordingly, we expect the outcome of these meetings in this great city to have consequential impact and alter the development trajectory of our continent. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, allow me to briefly go back to the history of Afreximbank's formation and the journey it has taken thus far. I think some of you will remember that the years leading to the formation of Afreximbank were turbulent, underpinned by global sovereign debt crisis, while elevated Afro-pessimism contributed to a mass withdrawal of trade and development finance from the continent. I want to remind us that the establishment of Afreximbank was Africa's response to the confluence of crises during that time.
So size of institutions matter. They matter to drive our continental development. This is the reason it is also an imperative for African governments to invest in strengthening these institutions, to continue to invest in strengthening these institutions through capital injections and through policy protections. The alliance, I will also call on the Alliance of African Multilateral Financial Institutions. We must continue to pool our resources together. Scale matters, as I just mentioned, and that's to unleash our collective resources with deliberateness, with intentionality, to ensure that we drive an Africa determined, Africa that is led, an Africa that finances its development agenda.
Now, let me say that it is a very, very great honor and privilege for me to be here today to deliver the opening remarks at this year's annual meeting of the African Export-Import Bank, Afreximbank, with the overarching theme, building the future on decades of resilience. Permit me to begin by congratulating the bank on its 32nd anniversary and to commend the President, Professor Oramah, and other members of the Board of Directors, as well as the entire Afreximbank team, for its unwavering commitment to the transformation of the continent's economic landscape. This continues to inspire hope, confidence, and concerted action. The theme of today's session, 32 years of resilient growth and transformation, could not have come at a more auspicious time. It speaks directly to the essence of this institution and the road of travel of our continent.
Continuing with this year's theme, former heads of state shared powerful insights on navigating Africa's development journey, reflecting on how they mobilize financing, manage debt, and strengthen the role of development banks and multilateral institutions across the continent.
When I took over as chief executive of Nigeria in 1999, I will not go the way they say it. They talk of empty purse. Mine was below empty purse. because empty purse means that there's nothing in the pocket. Mine was, I inherited a debt service of $3.5 billion every year. And I had a little bit less than that in the purse, in the reserve. So, and yet, we had to carry out development. So the first thing is, what can we do to stop the empty purse and start filling up the purse? So, of course, I will come back to that later. I have to go for debt relief at all costs. It took almost 5 years to achieve that, in fact 6 years almost, but it was achieved. So that made me to be able to save $3.5 billion a year for debt relief.
We mobilized our finances mainly from domestic sources. As you all know, we have policy banks, Ethiopian Development Bank and the Ethiopian Commercial Bank, which are all state-owned banks. And that helped us a lot by generating savings in Ethiopia. I think that was the main reason we were able to finance the mega dam you all know, which is the Renaissance Dam of Ethiopia, from domestic sources, which is around $5 billion. Second, our rating by the time was B+, so we were able to generate $1 billion to build 14 industrial parks in Ethiopia, which is an exemplary. Now Afreximbank is emulating and continuing on supporting African nations. And I think this is investing in productive sector is one of the key. We are not borrowing money for consumption. We are borrowing money for productive sector development.
Despite the fact that we are separated by an ocean and the sixth region is on the other side of the ocean. And I think it's true to say that we share more than a common ancestry. And the group of leadership to which I belong came into office in a world where the international institutions determine the policy within which we were forced to operate, and the institutions that guide them were not created by us, and they were not intended for the benefit and the development of us. And therefore, central to my presentation is the fact that we have to devise together our own economic strategies, not in accordance with traditional policy models created for others, which are not suited for our particular countries.
Right. The institutions that we need to propel our development up till today are not in our hands. Prime Minister Patterson talked about the structure of the IMF. And he was illustrating one simple point. If you don't control the institutions of finance, you will not be able to finance your development. And I think that that is the matter that we need to pay the greatest attention to. How do we develop institutions that can enable us fund our development that we ourselves control? Two or three small examples. Afreximbank today, I think, has a share capital of some $6 billion United States dollars. I'm right, somewhere in that arena. The Japan Bank for International Cooperation has a share capital of nearly 20 billion United States dollars. The Japanese Exim Bank, the Chinese Exim Banks figures are in the region of $54–55 billion. That is all the difference between what Japan can do to fund its development and what we can do to fund our development. So there's a need for us to focus on what is it that we can do to transform the situation.
Current heads of state also weighed in on the evolving global political economy, offering perspectives on how their nations aim to navigate today's fractured landscape. The focus, rebuilding stronger, deepening trade ties, and accelerating investment flows across the continent through the AfCFTA framework.
Consider what the global economic landscape is today, being defined by global uncertainty, the uncertainty that attends us, and the decline of multilateralism. In that context, when we consider currencies and what it is for the Bahamas, for example, and many other jurisdictions in the Caribbean, our currency, the Bahamian dollar, and a lot of other CARICOM currencies is pegged to the US dollar and the US dollar alone. For us, we should be considering having a basket of currencies to peg our dollar to, and that's what we are thinking and trying to advance at this moment. And for me, and when we talk about trade and how trade is, where currency is necessary for trade, and the disparity or the differences in our currencies, what I would like for consideration to be given is for the development of a digital currency to which all the African countries and CARICOM countries could be a part of for the purposes of facilitating trade, just as the PAPS initiative is facilitating trade in the African countries, and we are now piloting it in the Caribbean to see how it could facilitate trade amongst ourselves and Africa. Perhaps we could also move to what I call a virtual currency that we can advance for the purposes of assisting and facilitating trade.
At the risk of not being redundant, I think it's important to re-emphasize that in the case of Africa, you probably have 54 different currencies. And so if we talk about how we move forward, it also means, I think in this case, getting us to a point where, incidentally in the Caribbean, we may have about 8 different currencies as well. So it obviously means a consolidation of less currencies that we can all work towards ultimately getting us to a point where there is an African currency that includes the diaspora. And if we're able to do so, it's not just about trade, it's also about the movement of people. Because as someone reminded me today, you could be a Nigerian who invests in the US, but you may not be a Nigerian who can get to the US because you don't get a visa to go to the US. So if we have the currencies that allow us to trade with ourselves, then there's really no need to go to the US.
I want to make one important, I think, remark as we conclude. We who are currently in office, I think, need to realize that the global economy that we are in is not only fragile, but it differs from country to country in our continent. And therefore, what is important first, I think, is to consolidate, build resilience of the economies of our region. And for this, I want to point out a few areas. One, make sure that the macroeconomic fundamentals are right. And in particular, I don't see any reason at all why Africa should continue importing food from outside. And therefore, we need to keep our handle on food inflation. Second is on energy-driven inflation. We can collaborate as African countries to make sure that energy inflation is contained, and these are two major drivers of instabilities. So this is one important point. The second important point, the global turbulences should be a lesson to all of us to collaborate even more within the African continent. So there are regional projects that we need to work together. Africa is disconnected, continues to be disconnected. Why don't we work on regional transportation projects, work on regional or power interconnectors so that we are able to put together our resources with the support of regional development banks like Afreximbank.
Building on the foundation laid by his predecessors, President Oramah's leadership elevated Afreximbank into a continental powerhouse, driving industrialization, enabling seamless payments across borders, and advancing Africa's trade integration agenda. As he addressed the gathering for the final time as president, Oramah reflected on a decade of bold decisions and unwavering commitment to Africa.
I gave the job the best of my energy, intellect, courage, and determination. As a result, between 2020, the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, and May 2025, and with the strong support of our shareholders, Afreximbank invested approximately $120 billion in Africa and the Caribbean, and $150 billion in the 10 years I was president. These must rank among the highest by any standards. And the fact that we invested $150 billion and have a capital of $43 billion tells you that Africans pay their debt. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, we have collectively over the past decade built a solid financial institution that is good for global Africa. Total assets and guarantees grew more than eightfold between September 2015 and April 2025 to reach $43.5 billion. Total revenues also rose sevenfold, reaching $3.24 billion from $408 million in 2015. Net income amounted to about $1 billion last year, about 700% increase from the level of $125 million in 2015. Internal capital generation and very strong support from shareholders through significant additional equity investments saw shareholders' funds rise from about $1 billion in September 2015 to $7.5 billion in April 2025. With callable capital reaching $4.5 billion from $450 million in September 2015. Liquidity remained very strong, with sources of funding much more diversified in 2024 than in 2015, due to the activities of the African Resource Mobilization Unit, which we created in 2016, and which saw the share of African sources of funding rise from just about 11% in 2015 to almost 37% in May 2025. At group level, the Fund for Export Development in Africa and the Afreximbank, our insurance management subsidiary, started making significant contributions to profit and growing in scope and depth. Beyond profits, these subsidiaries have also started fulfilling their mandate with further investing equity in various sectors across 13 countries, including technology, creative industry, industrial infrastructure, financial institutions, energy, and so on. Despite the challenging operating environment, the bank group was able to continue with the tradition of returning value to shareholders through annual dividends distribution. Aggregate dividends payments from 2015 to 2024 reached $1.35 billion. I must at this juncture thank shareholders once again for a significant reinvestment of these dividends, with 50 to 70% of the dividends reinvested annually throughout that period. A strong vote of confidence in your bank and management. Today, Afreximbank has become the trusted institution for mitigating the adverse impact of economic shocks and the primary source of vital medium to long-term financing for the African private sector and critical sectors of the African economy. It is important to note that this trajectory of growth and relevance did not start with me, but goes back to my predecessors who grew the bank multiple folds from where they took it. That is why, as I look ahead, I see the bank at no less than $250 billion in total assets and guarantees in 10 years, when my successor will be stepping down. I have no doubt that we would see that even better, given the strength, depth, and scope of the bank group today.
Today is your day, Prof. Oramah. Listening to the account and the report rendered eloquently by you, with the conclusion of lessons for us, your friends, partners. It is a great honor to stand here and say, well done. Welcoming all of you to Abuja for the 32nd Annual Meetings of the African Export-Import Bank. Nigeria is a fitting host for this pivotal gathering as Africa's most populous nation and one of the strongest voices for unity and progress. More than a routine meeting, this is a moment to reflect on our shared resilience and renew our commitment to shaping Africa's future boldly and deliberately. The theme of this year's meeting, Building the Future on Decades of Resilience, is timely and profound. Afreximbank, under Professor Benedict Oramah's steadfast leadership, has grown its assets from $5 billion to over $37 billion in a good time. Its decade of leadership saw the bank champions Africa's pandemic response, drive industrialization, support the African Free Trade Area, and the continent's creative economy. Its legacy is one of the generational impact. Thank you. "32 years ago, Afreximbank was born from Africa's resolve to own its own development, drive it with over $250 billion, mobilized for the trade and development. $150 billion in the last decade alone, the bank has become a pillar of Africa and progress, Africa's progress. Nigeria has proudly benefited from over $52 billion in support directed into energy, agriculture, infrastructure, manufacturing, healthcare, and creative industries. Flagship projects such as Dangote and Bua refineries, the African Medical Center of Excellence, and the African Quality Assurance Center embody confidence in Nigeria, in Nigeria's future and Africa's potential. This partnership extends beyond capital. Nigeria's former approval of the Pan-African Payment Settlement System PASS is a significant step towards financial independence. Thank you, Oramah.
In a surprise turn of events, Nigeria's President Bola Ahmed Tinubu conferred the national honor of Grand Commander of the Order of the Niger on Professor Benedict Oramah in recognition of his contributions to African trade and Nigeria's economic development.
I have the honor and privilege to recognize you. The outstanding contribution of Professor Benedict Oramah by conferring you with one of Nigeria's highest one of the Nigerian highest honors, the Grand Commander of the Order of Niger. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, history was made. A round of applause for His Excellency, the President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. He saved the best for last.
It was a week of accolades and cheers for President Benedict Oramah as tributes poured in, recognizing a decade marked by bold vision and decisive leadership.
Over the last 30 years, the contribution of Afreximbank to supporting trade, intra-Africa trade, is nothing short of extraordinary. I think the mandate was adhered to, the objective continuously achieved, the interventions that have been made, the financing that has been made over the decades in special economic zones, in trade corridors, in digital trade tools, have really positioned our continent for to take advantage of the AfCFTA of an expanded market. Because the tools that Afreximbank introduced enable businesses, our private sector, to take advantage of this market. So it has been really an incredible 32 years, and I am confident that the next decade and the next leadership of Afreximbank will be equally committed to this mandate and this vision. The last year, the board of Afreximbank adopted a 10-year strategy, 5 to 10-year strategy, which in broad terms ensures that the vision is there's continuity. Of course, a different leader will come with with a different style, but broadly the substance will remain, and the adherence to the mandate will remain.
I'd like to share a short story, and that story captures everything. I was a banker before, and in 2010 I moved on and I decided to diversify and do what some of my friends have been doing in trying to help empower Africa and transform the continent. So one of the sectors we decided to invest in was the energy sector. And energy investment, as you all know, is highly capital intensive. So we approached Shell for a bilateral conversation, had a bilateral conversation with Shell to acquire some of their assets in Nigeria. And this was, we started the conversation in 2017. Shell finally agreed. And, but to agree, they said we needed to show evidence of capacity, because they get many inquiries from people. And so the asset we wanted to acquire from Shell, we identified OML 11 and OML 17. The sum we agreed with the Shell was $2.5 billion. And we needed to show proof of this money before proceeding. And we tried on our resources, but we had a shortfall of $750 million. And because we needed debt of 30%. We ran to Afrexim. We ran to Professor Oramah, and between Afrexim and African Finance Corporation, AFC, Afrexim wrote a check of, or supported, committed to supporting us with $600 million, and African Finance Corporation, 150. But what is very impressive about it is the speed and how it was done. And because of this, we were able to do this transaction, even though towards the end, we had a hiccup from our own government in Nigeria. The then President Buhari's administration did not think that OML 11 and 17 should be in the hand of the private sector, even though it was controlled by Shell, which was a private sector, international private sector. And then they said we should choose one. So we chose one and reduced the size of the transaction. But we took over this asset in 2020. We concluded this transaction in 2020 in the midst of COVID. And today, without Afrexim's involvement, because you talked about African capitalism, which is the private sector role in developing the continent, without their intervention, we would not have been able to do the transaction. Today, this acquisition we made with the support of Afrexim has gone on to become extremely transformative, not just for us, the investor, but for the continent.
And also the mission of Afreximbank is to connect all these dots. The trade financing is there. They are not the only ones. There is also Africa Finance Corporation. There are other banks. Once they build, if they are going to raise capital, believe me honestly, today, even if I'm not going to make money, I would rather invest in banks that have the same vision like Afreximbank, because that's the only way that we can develop our continent. You know, I mean, forget about most of these other banks. Their interest is not for Africa to grow. We must make sure we take it as our own focus, as our vision that, look, how do we make Africa great? Africa can only be made great by Africans.
Must see how to deliver big. I want to use an example that I am very familiar with. Many years ago, and I would say perhaps about a decade ago or so, the president of the Afreximbank, Professor Oramah, who is someone I have known, went through relatively challenging times on his health. And this is something that is pretty well known. And he was able to surmount those challenges. He was able to surmount those challenges. And as a result of surmounting that, he made a promise to himself and to the hundreds of millions of Africans. And that promise was to ensure that he brought a first-class health facility to the continent. Believe me, at that time, and I remember this very well, it appeared as an outlandish dream. How can that ever happen? And dare say, in the journey, I witnessed certain experiments they had tried to do, which failed. And honestly, I was extremely delighted when a couple of weeks ago, the realization of that big, bold, and audacious dream came to light through the launching of the Africa Medical Center for Excellence. A center that has been created in conjunction with King's College London, a very well-reputed household name in the field, and is also determined to replicate this in other parts of Africa. Professor Oramah, I salute you. It is not many that have the fortune of making these big dreams come true. It is not many. And I'm particularly pleased that as you exit your 10 years of leadership at the Africa Export-Import Bank, you have been able to realize this dream.
First, let's understand what Afreximbank has done. So they conceived the idea, they sponsored and funded the construction and development of it. Yeah. Very important to get started. Yeah. They're not gone. They're still the majority shareholder in that hospital. Now, since the hospital's been developed, we've had two other large and important investors join us. One in NNPC, the other one in Bank of Industry. What that means for us, and because of the business model, which is designed to self-fund the ongoing operations, we don't have to worry about paying for service agreements or maintenance agreements. The equipment will continue to function and operate as it should. But we worked with some very sharp consultants in Deloitte, PricewaterhouseCoopers, to make sure that the financial modeling was done in such a way that it will sustain itself going forward.
On the sidelines of the annual meetings, President Oramah unveiled the second edition of his seminal work, Foundations and Evolutions of Structured Trade Finance. The book distills over 3 decades of experience in African trade finance into a practical guide for policymakers, financiers, and institutions, offering fresh insights into how Africa can finance its own development through innovative, homegrown solutions.
There's some recent research that says that no more than 10% of books make it into a second edition. And Foundations of Evolutions and Structured Trade Finance is fast becoming a classic. I firmly believe that in 25, maybe even 50 years' time, it'll be one of those rare books that has grown over many editions to create a lasting legacy for positive change. I believe it was Benjamin Franklin who said, if you want something doing, ask a busy person. In spite of Franklin's maxim, I still fail to understand how Professor Oramah found time in his extraordinarily busy schedule to deliver his manuscript on time and to such a high quality.
Most importantly, I'm personally grateful to each of you for taking time out of your very busy schedules to attend this book signing event, to celebrate the release of my new book titled The Foundations and Evolutions of Structured Trade Finance, published by Globe Law and Business, London. The first edition and this new edition of the book represent my effort to share the tremendous knowledge I've gained while practicing trade finance over the past 33 years, primarily at Afreximbank, but also at the Nigerian Export-Import Bank. When I joined Afreximbank in 1994, the world economy was still grappling with a severe sovereign debt crisis, and structured trade finance was just beginning to emerge as a tool for financing trade in challenging markets. As Afreximbank commenced operations in 1994, we adopted this concept and practice due to its risk mitigation benefits. Essentially, it empowers practitioners to be innovative, as its fundamental principle allows for the transfer of risks from parties who are less able to bear them to those who are more capable of absorbing them. At that time and up to the late 1990s and early 2000s, the trade of most developing economies was with the OECD countries, that is, developed economies. For Africa, for instance, advanced economies of Europe and North America accounted for about 70% of its trade. Given that country risk was at that time the central issue to manage in financing trade in developing countries, structured trade finance was devised as a way of transferring the unacceptable African country risk to the more acceptable country risk of developed economy. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, having laid out the context of this new book, I have yet another heavy task before me this evening. And that is to recognize all those who truly own this product. First, this new volume was made possible by the encouragement of our publishers, Globe Law and Business Limited. I'm most grateful to Sharon O'Neill, founder and managing director of Globe Law and Business Limited, who was unable to join us today. In her stead is Mr. James Smith, the CEO, who eloquently delivered the opening statement. I'm grateful to you at Globe Law for putting us under pressure to deliver on time. I'm indebted to Mr. Christopher Dodo and Mr. Jean-Louis Ekra, both former presidents of Afreximbank. This product is an output of the seed they sowed and nursed over the last 3 decades. You both placed knowledge, acquisition, and dissemination in the heart of the bank's operations. Special thanks also to Richmond Zene and Doreen Bafu, both in my office, for their assistance, often at the expense of their time and weekends, in bringing this project to fruition. I'm most grateful for the research inputs provided by other colleagues at the bank, Gwen Nwaba, Abba Ofon, Vinay, Peter Olowanoni, Humphrey Nwugo, Edmond Bobo, and Vitalis Ekene Uzo. To my wife and family, I say we have collectively delivered. For years, you allowed me to take away quality family time as I worked on both editions of this book. When I become lazy, your constant reminder of the work left undone lifted my energy and made the book possible. I'm forever grateful to you as well as our daughters for not allowing me to use family time as an excuse not to work. I thank my friends for the encouragement. Some of you made sure that the book was produced by pushing me and pointing me to valuable materials. There's a friend of mine in the US who normally made sure that the time I reserved for writing the book, when on holidays, that I kept to it, rather than going out with him to have good time. I'm grateful to all of you for joining us here today and for all the support I've received, both professionally and in the work we are launching today. Thank you very much.
It was a moment of transition at the closing press conference as President Benedict Oramah formally introduced his successor, Dr. George Elombi, who was unanimously endorsed by the Afreximbank board, alongside several other key resolutions shaping the bank's future.
We made very important decisions, and I would like to summarize a few of them that I'm allowed to talk about in public. The first is that we had a very smooth process of appointing my successor, who is by my left, Dr. George Elombi. The vote went smoothly, and he received unanimous support, 100% of the votes. They also elected 2 new board members to replace those who retired. And I'm sure the details of this will be provided to you in due course. They also approved the financial statements and they noted the annual report of the bank and approved the financial statements for 2024. They also approved the dividend declarations as proposed by the board of directors. That is a dividend payout of $350 million, of which $50 million will be a donation made to the concessional, towards the establishment of the concessional finance window they approved in 2023.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen of the press. Thank you for being part of this movement. You've asked me to be brief. I'm going to be brief, actually. The shareholders met today. They made a series of decisions, but what emerges from those decisions are essentially 2 things. One, the affirmation of the work that Afreximbank has been doing over the last 10 years. They are pleased with the financial position of the institution, and they are also pleased with the projects, the interventions of the institution they want us to carry out. 2 is what the president just said a minute ago, which refers to their reaffirming their support for Afreximbank and their desire to continue to honor the obligations they entered into under the treaty establishing the institution. Those are the 2 messages we take out of here. But as you would see from the wider body of those who attended the general meeting, those messages were repeatedly made clear throughout the week. From seminar to panel sessions to side events, those are the 2 messages that came clear. Mr. President, the final but third message is the resounding, extraordinary applause that was given to you as a person for the levels of intervention of the institution, the level of relevance of the institution in the continent over the last 10 years. And for that, we have nothing else. The best way to say thank you to you is to seek to do a little more than you did.
It's been a week of bold ideas and pivotal transitions here at the 32nd Annual Afreximbank Annual Meetings in Abuja as Professor Benedict Oramah closes a defining decade of leadership. The torch now passes on to George Elombi, tasked with steering the resilient institution into its next chapter. I'm Kenneth Ibomo. Thanks for watching.